How's everybody this evening? Good. So, when did your consciousness begin? When you first opened your eyes, that took a little while before, because you had to be born first, and then even then you didn't open your eyes. So, when did consciousness begin? Did it begin when you were born? When you were conceived? At conception. So at conception there was a cell meets another cell, and then magically consciousness begins.
When the brain stem forms.
The brain stem forms. When does that form? Somewhere down the track. So somewhere, at what stage of its formation does it? You never asked yourself when this happened? I mean,
maybe it's continuous. Consciousness is continuous.
it's continuous, right? We have a mystic amongst us, okay, fine. It's continuous, beginning and ending when?
What is consciousness? At death.
At death it stops. When does it start? At birth.
When you're old
But
enough to have
when you're old enough to be conscious.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
So you're conscious when you're old enough to be conscious.
There are different levels of consciousness. Consciousness is not just a single...
Any consciousness, any. I'm being very free, any consciousness.
When you conceive them. Well, I think it's there.
It's there.
Enters
It enters. So there's an it.
the soul, the consciousness.
Is it an it? Is it something from us? Is it an it separate from us? Is it us?
It's a state of mind.
A state of mind. So until you have mind, there's no consciousness.
Maybe we need to
Correct.
define the word.
When does mind begin?
What is consciousness? We need to
At the point of
define
birth.
what it is. No, because you've got...
No, I don't want to go on a tangent of definition yet, because
Okay.
then we'll spend a whole hour just thinking about defining it. Let's assume we all sort of intuitively sense and know what it is. I just want to know when it begins.
At birth.
At birth. But
In
don't...
the placenta, the baby may be aware of sensation.
Or maybe, or is, or is not.
It
Women
will
tell
be,
us.
But I don't think it forms to a level of what you would describe as consciousness.
When our parents requested from us.
Is it a type of emotion?
That's a good one.
That's going to definition, which I'd like to avoid if I can. Last chance.
Maybe it's part of your neshama.
Okay. Clearly, it doesn't make any sense that consciousness is when one cell meets another cell and unites with another cell. So it must occur later or earlier. They're the only two possibilities, right? So what you're looking here is a model of consciousness. This page 1 is a model of consciousness. When it is appreciated by you and me, that's well down the track when we have materialized and become physical. But consciousness exists long before we've materialized. Consciousness exists long before we were born and long before we were conceived. You exist out of body, before body. Body becomes your mechanism of expressing that consciousness in a finite physical world. But in an infinite world that's not bounded by any boundaries, consciousness still exists. So every one of these attributes of consciousness, which have names, exists out of body. So if I say there exists a phenomenon, an attribute called chokhmah, you and I recognize it only in body. Chokhmah is a phenomenon of the operation of the brain, the result of which is we bring to awareness something that we were not aware of before. Chokhmah is bringing from the subconsciousness to the consciousness. Okay? However, Chokhmah exists out of body. It's a godly attribute. It exists on every plane. It exists within the realm of the inanimate. It exists in the world of the angels. It exists in the world of creation. The first level of creation was Chokhmah, Koachmah, the potential of everything. All I'm trying to indicate to you here is that we are much more than what we appear to be here on the surface of life. And that you exist far beyond, but unembodied. So when I speak about these various attributes, these sephirot, as they refer to, I'm referring to a template of potential that exists at spiritual levels long before it materializes into the body. You have a persona, you have a personality spiritually, and that becomes embodied physically. When we're talking about the sephirot, we're talking about your potential at a spiritual level before it's actualized. When it's actualized, it becomes a human expression. So the first three of Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, when they're actualized, become what you said earlier, your mind. But Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at exist without mind per se in a body. There is a divine mind. There's a mind that's beyond our comprehension, beyond physicality and the like. That's why it's so hard that the Jewish spiritual system is such an abstract notion, and it's so sophisticated, it's so sublime, that it's very hard to access. So that's the way it was for some thousands of years. Moses taught it at Har Sinai to a very few, to a very limited number. It was kept as a subterranean tradition. It became known as Kabbalah, the process of being mekabel, receiving the tradition. And it was only begun to be put into some sort of format and written form in the 2nd century, the Arizal. And then as a consequence of that, another 1,000 years passed before it began to be published, Zohar. And then it took several more centuries before that study group became publicized in Sfat, so a limited number of people could access it, but it still remained highly cryptic until the Baal Shem Tov's time, when the teachings of Kabbalah became popularized by being explained in a format that you and I can access it. So the only way we understand this model is through the teachings of Chassidut, specifically Chabad Chassidut as such, and that's the way I'm explaining it. Today, we're looking at a notion of depression and hope. Depression is a mindset or an emotion.
Mindset.
Mind,
Mindset.
mind,
It's also an emotion.
it's also an emotion. Both. In other words, depression is a complex state of being that's the result of the two variables, as are all our human expressions, mind and emotion. And therefore, to be able to cope with depression, we have to deal with mind and we have to deal with emotion. What's our rule of thumb? What comes first, mind or emotion?
Mind.
Mind. That's our rule of thumb. Not everyone has to agree with that, but it is our rule of thumb. We are postulating that there's no such thing as an emotional disposition until the mind has provided an interpretation. It may be a very, very short-term interpretation. It may be so short, a fraction of a second that we're unaware of it, so it's dominantly emotional in our experience. But it still comes from an interpretation. It comes from mind. So clearly, if we're going to cope with this particular phenomenon, we have to understand its dynamics in terms of mind and then understand its emotions and work backwards from there. Let's look at page 2. What's the difference between sadness bad mood, and depression. Anyone offer me some suggestions?
Time frame?
Time?
Yeah. Depression lingers.
Depression lingers. Everyone agree?
Sadness and bad mood are temporary.
Temporary conditions?
states of conditions, whereas depression is more ongoing and deeper.
Okay.
You can be influenced or cajoled out of sadness or a bad mood. Depression is a little more lingering.
Therefore, you and I, when we're referring to the word depression here, obviously we're talking about what might be called clinical depression. Because the word depressed and depression can be used in a very ordinary use of language, just to be a synonym with sadness. So we're talking about, as you correctly interpreted, depression as being something much more profound. But I'm not going to be using it tonight in the context of clinical depression, because to handle clinical depression, you cannot do it by and large with talk therapy, coping mechanisms, natural kinds of plant therapies and the like. It will not deal with clinical depression, because clinical depression is a state where the chemistry of the body has been altered. How it's been altered is a different matter, and therefore the only way it can be countered is again through chemical mechanisms to neutralize it.
Is that measured by blood testing?
You mean how exact
How
is
do you
it?
know that? Yeah, that there's a chemical imbalance.
Because I think from a Western point of view, because the use of chemicals has been able to undo it.
Yeah. It may be that overused.
Yeah, so the truth is that scanning techniques have now clearly identified the differences in brain in depressed people and non-depressed people. And you can actually see that it's got to do with a lot with serotonin boosting and certain chemical results in the body as such, lack of serotonin in many instances. And therefore, under those circumstances, the addition of serotonin boosters in some instances can actually ameliorate the whole clinical condition of depression. So there's sufficient proof to indicate that.
So, sorry, another question.
Keep going.
Do you think taking meditation is a good thing? Like, is that not the last resort?
I don't know if there's a first or last resort. I believe Hashem has provided many, many mechanisms to keep us healthy. And all of them have validity. And all of them have appropriate usage as such. In this one area of clinical depression, I think they're essential. I'm personally very much cautionary in the use of medications, and I generally enjoy natural therapies and natural maintenance. But this instance, when it gets to clinical depression, I've seen so many people who say, I'm going to try this, and I'm going to try that, I'm going to try that, and then 6 months later, 2 years later, 3 years later, exactly where they are. Okay, but that's not what we're going to talk about.
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to be actually depressed but not manifest what people would recognise as depression and still be able to function as relatively okay but actually be depressed?
No. Then it's not clinical depression. Okay. There are clear symptoms of clinical depression, wanting to stay in bed and not deal with anything, unable to enter into social contact, losing confidence in driving a car, being unable to conduct a conversation, not wanting to do so, withdrawals, and all sorts of other things like that. Okay? All right, so is there a difference between sadness and bad mood and depression? For our purposes, not very much, not for our class today. We're talking about how do you handle situations where you are sad, where you are in a bad mood, and where you have a depression, but not the kind of depression that requires medical attention as such. You feel depressed. Many people feel depressed at times. Doesn't mean you have to run to a psychiatrist as soon as you feel depressed. Okay? However, it is unnerving and it's not pleasant, and it can become habitual, and you can, as a consequence of that, spiral down into a much more serious condition. So we want to prevent it at the inception. So which of these are most symptomatic of depression? Have a look at points 1 to 10. Feeling down in the dumps more days than not. Well, that's sometimes not that uncommon. Usually negative and tired and bored, sometimes. Everything is an effort, like going uphill. Poor appetite or overeating. Can't sleep or sleep too much. Turn to drugs, alcohol to alter the mood. Crave caffeine and excess sugary sweets. Don't allow the experience of pleasure. Can't make decisions or concentrate. Feel worthless, hopeless and useless. Well, if you have any one of these occasionally, that could be considered within the realm of normalcy. If you have 7 out of 10 of these, I really think you're clinically depressed and need attention.
That's on a permanent basis?
Yeah, ongoing, pretty ongoing. In other words, that's your general state of being. General state of being.
So how would you differentiate between sadness and depression?
Which kind of depression? The way we're using it here, which is...
Yeah, we're using it here.
Okay, so what I'm saying is if you've got 7 of these, it's more than what the way we're using it here.
So you could be very well sad on
Yeah.
that particular moment.
Yeah, that's fine. You're allowed to be sad at times.
So you're not really depressed, you could be just sad.
Correct. But if you're sad all the time, then I'd be concerned. Alternatively, if you've got 7 of these 10, I'd be very concerned. Okay? So, if you have some of these occasionally, as we all tend to do, there are mechanisms that we have to employ in order to be able to overcome them for 2 reasons. 1, they're not pleasant. Number 2, it offends Judaism. There's an absolute teaching that says, Ivdu et Hashem besimcha. You should always serve Hashem with joy. You should always be in a state of happiness. That's the idealized state. And therefore, if we fall ever into a state of despair, upset, and the like, there's a little bit of emunah lacking. There's a little bit of faith lacking. There's a little bit of positive disposition lacking, etc. And we need to be able to counter that. Now, there are people who suffered depression and overcame them. People that you know very well. Florence Nightingale, Theodore Roosevelt, Princess Diana, Anthony Hopkins, Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, William James, Sigmund Freud. So, don't feel for one moment that it's, yes.
Sigmund Freud.
Yeah, Sigmund Freud. There you go.
There are hundreds of people, more than that.
Yeah, but these are the famous people. But we're talking about overcoming, not suffering it. Overcoming it, right? So let's look at some biological causes for these particular emotional states. We said that it's when it's clinical depression, there's an emotional and physical stress cause that causes a chemical change, a depletion in certain neurotransmitters that contribute to hope and optimism, primarily serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine, clearly identified. And that's why most of the medications are really an addition of these particular items so that they counter an individual's down state. The purpose is not to deprive a person of choice, nor to create in the person an artificial high. Proper dosages are to be able to get you back to a level playing field where you are yourself. That's the important thing. Then you can exercise free choice. You can't exercise free choice if one hand's tied behind your back, which states of depression are. Other biological causes: external, stress, alcohol, substance abuse. They trigger dormant gene-linked depressions. There are people who have inclinations towards sadness, inclinations towards depression, genetic inclinations. That's their nature. But that doesn't mean that you are forced to be. All of us have inclinations. Is there anyone in this room who's inclined to be impatient? Don't all rush me at once. Yeah, we have that inclination. Doesn't mean you have to be impatient. Some people have an inclination towards anger. Doesn't mean you have to be angry. We are all born with personality orientations. Whether we're able to take that personality orientation and direct it through our higher self, the Nefesh Elokit, or the lower self, the Nefesh Bahamit, is a matter of choice. Of course, if you allow it to function constantly in one direction, it'll become a habit. And what's a habit? A habit is a default state where you've created such a deep groove of the brain, in the mind, that you naturally flow in that direction. Then you have to undo that groove. You have to do something about it. Rambam, Maimonides, says the best way to undo negative habits is to go to the opposite extreme for a while. So, for example, if you are a stingy individual, all stinginess comes from insecurity. But if you're a stingy individual, Rambam says what you should do is force yourself to be a hugely generous individual, far beyond the norm. And somewhere along the line, you'll find yourself in the middle path, as he calls, etc. Okay? So the therapeutic approach the Rambam would pose is be an extremist for a while, of the opposite kind, no matter what it might be, that you're wanting to change within yourself. So spend just 30 seconds asking yourself, what's the most negative trait that I possess, and only you know yourself? And what would you be like if you went to the opposite extreme? Just imagine for a while. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you. One of the teachings in Judaism about giving charity is that it's much better to give 100 times a day 1 cent than to give even $1,000 once. Why?
It gets you into the habit of giving.
You're changing your default character. You're changing your default nature. The more often you do something, the more frequently you do something, the more you are creating that to be the new norm. So I always tell people who do have such a problem, have a tzedakah box on your desk or wherever in your workplace, and every 30 minutes put a coin in. Very easy. 24 times during your workday if you're a 12-hour worker. But that's true with everything. Say a person is impatient with their children. They have to catch themselves in the moment of impatience and artificially practice patience in that moment, over and over again. All right, so you've had a little bit of a look at yourself perhaps and come up with an imaginary circumstance in that regard. Okay, so you can push an inclination to its expression biologically. And one of the major aspects of our life that pushes us this way is stress. And unfortunately, stress is in a much higher state today than it ever was. Now, I know that people say, hold on, that's not so true. Look how bad life used to be. Life was much, much worse than it is today. There were many more wars, there were more famines, there were more this and that, and we didn't have a supply, etc., etc. But I think that the human approach to negativity was radically different then than today. Today we're at the mercy of the idea makers who are constantly, day in and day out, creating insecurity, and that's called news. And as I've said many times, the people who produce the news are producers of entertainment who know very, very well that the one thing that will addict us is bad news. Why? Because fear is a great attraction. And if you can be made to be afraid, you'll be glued to the screen, whatever kind of screen it might be. So, from the outside, we've got many more stressors in life today. The world is economically plugged into each other. When America sneezes, Australia catches a cold. Wasn't always like that, etc. Trump makes noise about North Korea, and people here are already deciding how they're going to have bomb shelters built in their backyard. Okay, so it is a stressful life. So stress plays a role. It takes a toll. and you have to be able to de-stress. That's not the purpose of this, not the purpose of our particular session today, to learn de-stressors per se, but the truth of the matter is it comes from mind followed by emotion. You have to interpret the situation differently and then feel differently. So I'm just putting it out there that there are biological causes, but there are also biological healing mechanisms. And one of them is self-centered hope. We're able to generate the hope. It comes from our own inner center. Hope amplifies the antidepressant treatment by fortifying your neurotransmitters. What am I saying here? What is it when we are told something that it works and we believe it works and scientifically it shouldn't work? What do we call that?
Miracle.
Faith.
Good. Miracles, one.
Faith.
Faith. But there's a more technical term that's used today.
Placebo.
Placebo. Right? What's a placebo? A placebo is, it's a fake. It doesn't work. The only problem is placebos do work. How do you explain that?
Because you are what you believe.
Because you are what you believe. That's a good statement. But let's see if we can actually bring it down to some sort of a physical and tangible explanation at the same time. Why does a placebo work? Why have there been instances, double-blind tests that clearly show things as radical as changes in skin conditions? Physically, you can see a change in skin condition by using some sort of a treatment which clearly scientifically should not work, but it does work.
Because you're told it works.
So why should, if I tell you something, why should it? If I tell I can fool you, but how can I fool your skin?
Your mind is your most powerful organ.
That's true. Go one step further, and therefore?
And therefore you can create your own reality.
Therefore?
Heal yourself.
Well-being.
Yeah. We can affect ourselves down to the cellular level of our body through our belief systems. So if you believe that something works, it'll be as efficacious as something that has a direct cause and effect relationship. So it's very, very important. That's why the first line here says, hope amplifies the antidepressant treatment. Therefore, by taking antidepressants, if you are told to do so, if you do it with disbelief, you're creating a barrier to their efficacy. If you do it because you believe the doctor, it's much more likely that it will work. So a state of positivity, a state of hope, is a very, very important factor which assists the biology of things. Hope reprograms your biology and keeps you positive. Hope creates space for happiness and better functionality. Hope is known to improve performance by athletes and student scores. There are many, many instances that support these propositions as such. So what are we saying? We're saying again, state of mind or state of emotion. What is hope? Which one?
It then affects the emotion.
State of mind that affects the state of emotion. Everything's got to be both. When you believe something, you actually elevate your emotional state. The act of belief derives somewhere from the mind. It goes beyond the mind eventually, but it begins with the mind as such. Hope accelerates recovery from heart attacks. Hope helps you remain mentally fit as you age. Hope lessens pain by increasing levels of endorphins. How do you create hope?
Maybe you have goals.
Goals that creates hopes.
Trying to create a positive mindset.
What, you just make a commitment to it?
You need a mentor.
In your own life, what have been the factors that have influenced you profoundly in positions you've taken in life? What are the most powerful features that have affected you in some shape or form? Powerful transformers.
That you visualize something.
Okay, but I'm saying in life, around you, what did you draw on in order to do that? It's very difficult to always do it from yourself because we're limited beings.
Knowledge.
Belief system.
From outside, belief system, but where do these come from?
Your interpretation.
That's you again, but where do these come from?
Seeing that it's
People
possible.
use the ranges.
It's books, it's people, it's circumstances of the, that you interpret, but most powerfully it's always going to be somebody else.
When somebody else
Examples.
believes in you.
Examples,
When someone else believes in you.
or someone else believes it, but there's always factors outside of yourself that tend to support you and give you that particular sense that we call hope. It's very hard to generate from yourself. That's why it's important to live in a community. That's why it's very important to have friendships. That's why it's very important to be able to turn to people. Because people are the most important features that can transform you outside of yourself. Otherwise you're trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, which is very, very hard to do. Terribly important to live in a community, and that's why there's a very strong teaching in Pirkei Avos and the Ethics of the Fathers, which is in Mishnah, which says, don't separate yourself from the community. And that's why in the Hasidic tradition, being an ascetic and removed from community is not our way at all. Asceticism certainly is a minority strand within Jewish teachings. Amongst some it was practiced, but the Hasidic movement is very much against it, because at the end of the day, you being part of community affords you the greatest opportunity for self-expression and also the greatest capacity to be able to draw from others for your own growth. Most important. So what does HOPE stand for? H-O-P-E. Helping other people get enlightened. Now, have a look at that. What's a feature of that phrase, helping other people get enlightened? When you read that a few times, there's something curious there.
It's not focused on the self.
Exactly, very, very good. Helping other people enlighten. In other words, when you give of yourself to others, inadvertently, you're helping yourself a tremendous amount. In passing, en passant, you're helping yourself. If you're out there to help yourself, it's very unlikely it will work. If you're out there helping others, it'll be reflected in you. Why? Because you and I have been created with the dominant feature called chesed. Chesed is our dominant feature. Chesed means the flow of giving. And when we're involved in the flow of giving, we're acting most naturally to our inner self. And under those circumstances, you end up being much better off because you're in sync with yourself. Helping others is probably the most therapeutic approach that you can take in terms of sadness and upset. We tend to be very I-oriented today, right? All of us know that in the room. All of us recognize that the iPhone with the I in front of it and the I this and I that clearly point that out, that we are very self-oriented. And that's a problem. That's the result, again, I repeat myself, of insecurity. When a person is insecure, they turn inward. Okay? When you're insecure, it's a fortress mentality. It's draw the drawbridge and make sure that they can't get across the moat, and whatever might be the case. You turn inwards. And that way madness lies, because you're never going to emotionally be able to jump out of yourself if you turn inwards. Only by turning outwards can you help yourself ultimately. Now, what about the three biggest natural antidepressants? Exercise, sunlight, and laughter. Let's look at them one by one. Why exercise?
Stimulates endorphins.
You're creating chemical changes in your body which coincide and happen to coincide with being an antidepressant. Because there are many things that we can do in life which are great things, but they don't create endorphins. Exercise happens to produce endorphins which create the possibility of giving yourself a lift as such. That's why if you have some area of life that creates bad mood or sadness and the like, take a walk. Immediately take a walk. Now, not a stroll. You've got to get your heart rate up, otherwise the endorphins don't flow, okay? So it's got to be something which really makes you move around a bit. So that's number one. Any exercise will do. Anything which creates that kind of production. Sunlight. Everyone heard of the phenomenon of SAD? S-A-D?
Seasonal affectation disorder.
Say it louder.
Seasonal affectation disorder.
Okay. People who suffer because of lack of sunlight. As you age, you tend to be much more sensitive to the lack of sunlight. And as you age, you hear more people say as they're aging, oh, blue skies make me feel so good, and etc. It's true for everybody, but you hear it more from people as they age because there is an effect. Some people are so sensitive to it that they move into depressed states in Melbourne weather. And what you can get in the marketplace is full spectrum lighting. Full spectrum lighting, so if you've got fluorescence in your home, substitute them for full spectrum fluorescence, and that'll affect your moods. Because I can't tell you the technology involved in that, but why certain spectrum of light missing affects you, but it does. And the other way is, of course, travel north. And that will help to a great extent. Yeah, sunlight is important because there are certain chemical reactions that respond through the eyes, specifically within the body. Laughter. What's laughter? Did you know that laughter and weeping are two mysteries? Why do you behave in such a ridiculous fashion when something's very funny? That's absolutely ridiculous. Your body shakes, you start making sounds out of your mouth, you become contorted, your face is non-recognizable, your mouth opens wide, certain gurgling sounds start to come out. I mean, because we're used to it, we take it for granted, but it's the most unusual human phenomenon. No one exactly knows the answer to this, by the way. We just accept it. Oh, he's laughing, she's laughing. The laughter is a very profound human expression at a spiritual level. There's a lot of Hasidus that talks about laughter and crying. Why do we secrete water when we cry? Called tears. And once again, when the weeping is bitter, once again there's contortions of the body in many, many different ways, and of the face. There's something about the way that we reach the edge of our physical container in laughing and crying. And therefore the body is no longer able to contain those emotions sufficiently. They need to be stretched in ways which they're not used to being stretched. Okay, that's a little sideline, but I want you just to think about that because it's very, very interesting to recognize there are many things in our life that we take for granted and we shouldn't be taking for granted. But laughter, that's why we raised it here, has an effect on a person. Laughter is a great therapeutic tool. You've probably read an article about even treating cancer with laughter as such, laughter therapy and the like. And there's some wonderful stories where it's actually worked in ways which are totally beyond explanation and the like. There's something very, very good for the body to laugh. And I would like to suggest that everyone watches a comedy of their choice once a day. I don't think my wife would be upset if I revealed that we try to watch Fawlty Towers every evening before going to sleep. Now that simply shows my age, that I laugh at such things. Many other people wouldn't even blink at those, etc. You may have your own particular source of laughter, but laughter is important. And it changes everything. It's a really magical potion. And it really deals with moods very, very successfully. It's very hard to be sad if you're laughing. What's the difference between grieving and depression?
I think grieving is a process that you have to go through.
One is physical, the other one is emotional.
I think that I'm misleading you by using the word grieving as such. Let me use a different word. What's the difference between feeling bitter and feeling sad? That's a better use of the English.
Bitterness is an element of anger attached to it.
Yes,
Anger and jealousy, I would say.
could be. Could be. The Hebrew word that we're using here is merirut, which some of you who are Hebraists will recognize comes from the Hebrew mar, which means bitter, and some of you will recognize it much better as maror, which you eat on Pesach because it's bitter herbs. Okay, same word. And the word for depression is atzvut, which sometimes translated sadness as such. But we're using the word bitterness here differently than the way that you've defined it. Merirut isn't the negative bitterness that is associated with anger as such and negativity. Merirut that we're talking about here deals, let me give you an example. When a person is depressed, then they tend to have low energy. They don't want to get up. They don't want to move. They don't want to go out. They don't want to enjoy themselves. Right? It's down. Merirut is up. But not up, happy. Up in a special case of upset. Upset. Notice the word upset. So, in Chassidus we explain it as follows. When a person is in a state of merirut, they're bitter about their circumstances with high energy wanting to change it. Merirut is a state of high energy of wishing to change a state of being. I want to change myself. I want to change my circumstances. I want to change. And you have to work, you have to act, and you have high energy. You want to do something about it. That's what merirut is. Whereas atzvut is the more normative, depressed state. And you can't do anything about it. You have no energy. You have low energy. You feel quite negative. You feel negative about the future. You feel negative about yourself, and you just don't physically move or do anything about it as such. So, atzvut is an expression of self-absorption. I know this sounds harsh, but when a person is depressed, they're in that moment highly egocentric. What does that mean? They're only concerned with themselves. They're preoccupied with themselves, not in a nasty way. We're not about egocentric and, he's an egotistic individual. Not in that sense, but in the true sense of the word, ego, self-centered. Nothing matters outside of them. It's only their own state of being. They're wallowing in their sorrow. Okay? That's the height of self-centricity as such, egocentricity. It's selfish, it's self-centered. Now, of course, it's unavoidable because it's a result of a chemical change in the body. So there's no fault attached. Fault could have been discussed earlier that led them to get themselves into that state. But even there you can't say fault. It could be the fault of people around them, all sorts of things, etc. And everyone's got their limits. Then it traps the person, and then you need to do something to untrap the person. Whereas when we use the word merirut, we're talking about an expression of something which energizes us to create change. Now, grieving in Judaism has that element. It's not the same way as in non-Jewish application of the word grieving. Sometimes in the non-Jewish application of the word grieving, it's almost akin to a little bit of depression as such. When we talk about grieving, we're talking about a process of creating the kind of mindset and emotion set that comes to terms with the movement away, the loss, the separation as such, and being able to move over a 12-month period into a positivity that elevates what's took place. That's why there's a period of the first 7 days, the 30 days, and the 11 months, etc., the first year as such. But the whole process is not one of just, I've suffered a loss, and therefore I grieve. That's still back to the I. It's to do with the fact of being able to elevate slowly the separation into a higher state where the separation serves a very positive function for you in your growth and people around you in their growth as a consequence of that departure as such. So there's an element there of merirut, not atzvut.
But if you've lost someone very dear to you in your life, how are you supposed, surely it's completely natural to grieve.
Yes, yes.
Become completely absorbed with that and the idea of that person not being in your life.
It's not inevitable, but it's common. I grant you that. And it's most normal. However, in our tradition, for example, what do we do on a yortzeit? You know what a yortzeit is? A yortzeit is the annual celebration of the departure of the dear departed. And what do we do then? Light a candle. And what else do we do? What else do we do? What else do we do? We make a l'chaim. Yortzeit, when I have yortzeit, on that morning when it's yortzeit, I come to shul with lekach, honey cake, a bottle of vodka, a bottle of whiskey, put it at the back of the table, and the whole shul makes l'chaim. Maybe you're not familiar with that. And everyone is smiling, and everyone is laughing, and everyone's drinking. Why? It sounds totally counter to the Western approach to a solemn occasion, surely it should be. Not at all.
You're celebrating their life.
You're celebrating what we call aliyas haneshama, the elevation of the soul. Every year, on a yortzeit, when we say Kaddish, their consciousness rises to a higher state. Their enlightenment reaches a higher place. And we celebrate it. Very different approach than what's common.
Who's enlightened?
The soul that's no longer with us. So we're happy for them. Okay? So that's very, very interesting in terms of that discussion took place because we moved into the consideration of grieving, and I just want to give you a different take on what the word grieving means in our tradition as such. So yes, it is normal to grieve in the contemporary sense, but the whole 7 days, 30 days and 11 months is a process where you actually move away from the self-absorption and become much more considerate of the soul's journey of the dear departed one and feel much more relieved that they're able to undertake that journey. Much healthier in passing also. Some of you mentioned in passing that one of the things we do is pray. Well, firstly, the word pray. When we use the word pray in English, we usually take a Christological vantage point, because we live in a Western society, and that has a lot of Christian overtones. And Christianity deals with prayer differently than Jewish people do, although Christian prayer derives from Jewish prayer. But of course it moved in a different direction. So have a look, there are 3 particular terms for prayer in the Jewish tradition. One is avodah. You'll find that the word avodah is a synonym for prayer. You know the word avodah, translation normally is work. Work, it's translated as work. If you go to work, well, you're a worker, you're an oved. Just common worker as such. But the word avodah here means spiritual work of self-transformation. So one of the functions of prayer is to work hard at growth and development. And tefillah, prayer, is a mechanism to achieve that. Tonight, again, it's not a night where I'm going to show you how Jewish prayer does that if you pray correctly, but that's one of the functions that it does. The second aspect of the word prayer is hitpalel, from mitpalel. Those of you who are grammar experts will know that this is a form of hitpa'el verb, which means reflexive, And therefore it's something to do within oneself. So prayer, the hitpalel, is got to do with introspective judgment. You're doing something within yourself. That's another dimension of tefillah. And if we were to do a study and a workshop on tefillah, all these three aspects I'd be explaining to you as we go along. And the third one comes from tefillah, tafel, which means secondary. The word tafel means secondary. It means make yourself secondary. It's another way of saying ego abnegation. You are not number one, you're number two. And therefore in a state of prayer we also practice ego abnegation. All these three, the work at personal growth, the idea of introspective judgment, and ego abnegation, militate against states of depression. And that's why praying is so supportive at such times. In the remaining 5 minutes, I want to take you through a little meditative journey if there are no questions on what we've spoken about so far. Put everything out of your hand. Feet resting symmetrically on the ground. Hands resting on knees and thighs. Back fairly straight without being too rigid. Head well balanced on your shoulders, and gently close your eyes. And just focus on your breath, gently breathing in and breathing out. Just quite naturally. If you can, try to breathe in and out through your nose. Become aware of the difference in temperature of the air entering the nasal passages compared to the temperature of the air as it exits from the nose. Cooler air entering, warmer air exiting. Feel the difference of the coolness and the warmth in the nose. Take a slower, deeper breath in down to the abdomen, extending your abdomen as you breathe in, and contracting your abdomen as you breathe out. Taking a deep breath in, expanding the abdomen, and contracting it to breathe out. And try to continue breathing deeply, slowly, abdominally, and gracefully. Bring to mind someone or something that you loved but is here no more. Recall your relationship to the person. Or to the pet. And become aware that the neshama of that person, of the pet, still exists with full consciousness and full awareness of you, even at this very moment. And they enjoy the bond that you create through this memory at this very moment. And because they are no longer hindered by a body, their awareness of you is complete. When you smile, they smile. Their happiness for you is perfect. No ego, no selfishness. Try to match that. Continue to love them egolessly. Not for what you gained from it, not from what you felt, but for what you gave them and are giving them right now with your positive memory. And put a small, faint smile on your lips that they will recognize. And allow them to enjoy your moment of joy. And bid them goodbye in the full knowledge that their awareness of you continues at all times. Focus again on your breathing, gently breathing in through the nose and out through the nose. Begin moving your fingers and your toes here in the room. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes, coming all the way back. Any final questions? Comments? Sharing?
You know, when people get very depressed, like in a clinical state, does that open up that person to become vulnerable to negative energies attaching to them?
They're usually imprisoned in their own shell and oblivious to positive and negative. They're already in a highly negative state, but it's an enclosed one. Vulnerability usually means that there's openness. Usually people who are depressed to that state, they're beyond vulnerability also.
Do you think that life after death has some implication in all this?
Absolutely. In terms of our recognition of ongoing relationship, absolutely so. In terms of a soul being reincarnated and therefore coming with a certain package of personality dispositions, yes, there also. But free choice and choosing to be who we want is always paramount. Always. Okay, we shall continue next week. Thank you.